September 1, 1943, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's hand hovered above the intelligence report, his single good eye scanning the words with cold amusement. The other eye had been lost the year before to American gunners, yet he remained one of Japan's most respected aces, an idol to younger aviators. His lips curved into a laugh as he read aloud the latest claim. The Americans had introduced a new fighter. They called it the Hellcat. According to the numbers before him, it was nearly twice the weight of his beloved Zero, burdened with armor, thick glass, and a radial engine so massive it made the silhouette resemble a torpedo bomber. To Sakai, this was no advance in design. This was proof, once again, that the enemy misunderstood the very essence of air combat. Through the tense, open flap, it could see the ranks of A-6M0 fighters lined neatly across the pierced steel planking of the airfield. Their long wings reflected the tropical sun, each aircraft poised like a blade ready for battle. For 2 years, these machines had carried Japan across the Pacific, sweeping aside everything the Allies had sent to oppose them. The British Hurricane, the American P-40 Warhawk, the Dutch Brewster Buffalo, the Australian Warrawain had survived their encounters intact. The Zero had established not only superiority, but dominance, a kind of aerial empire in which Japanese pilots ruled the sky with ratios of victory so staggering they seemed unreal even to their enemies. Sakai laid the report on the table and tapped it with his finger. Another mistake, he told the men crowded into the humid operations tent. Another machine built with steel instead of spirit. Let them send it. It will fall like the rest. Around him, younger pilots chuckled and nodded. The arithmetic supported their confidence. The Hellcat's loaded weight stood at 12,000 pounds. This was the foundation of Japanese aerial tactics. The turn. Since the earliest days of war in China, Zero pilots had relied on their ability to swing tighter, to carve the sky into impossible loops that no foreign fighter could follow. Dogfighting to them was not an exchange of speed and altitude, but a contest of maneuver, a duel fought with the elegance of swordsmen. In this doctrine, the Hellcat was already defeated before it took flight. The report's specifications seemed almost like parody. Armor plate surrounding the pilot, bulletproof windshields, self-sealing fuel tanks, hundreds of pounds of unnecessary protection that, in Japanese eyes, would do little more than drag the aircraft down. Even its radio, a bulky American model with long antenna wires, appeared wasteful. A true pilot, the veterans believed, fought with his senses, not with a voice buzzing in his ear. The Zero itself had dispensed with such luxuries. Many had no radios at all. Why burden an aircraft with dead weight when victory came from maneuver and precision? The Japanese pilots understood their own machine intimately. Its skin was formed from an alloy known as extra super duralumin, 30% lighter than the metals used by their enemies. The cockpit was a glass bubble without armor plate. The fuel tanks simple thin-walled reservoirs that would ignite easily but saved precious pounds. Every ounce of excess had been stripped away in service of agility and range. The result was a fighter that could dance at low speeds, climb with astonishing ease, and fly missions of more than 1,000 miles, an unheard figure for a single-seat interceptor. The numbers told a story that felt inevitable. In December 1941, at Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy had lost 29 aircraft while destroying more than 300 of the enemy's. In the Philippines, 7 aircraft lost against over 100 destroyed. At Darwin in northern Australia, 2 lost against 30 downed. In the Dutch East Indies, Allied air forces were obliterated within days. Everywhere the Zero appeared, it rewrote the rules. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed kills, described the sensation in his diary. Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not control input. American planes fly like trucks. They are powerful, but clumsy. They build fighters as they build cars, heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. The contrast was stark. American designs seemed shaped by factories, by engineers who trusted weight and horsepower over instinct. Japanese designs were shaped by warriors. The Zero was not merely a machine, but an extension of the pilot himself, a weapon honed like a sword. In such a world, the Hellcat's appearance was almost comedic. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, had reached the same conclusion. Reviewing the figures passed through Swedish intermediaries, he dismissed them as evidence of America's continuing ignorance. They have learned nothing, he wrote. This Hellcat is the continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome skill with mass, machinery over man. A Zero will fly circles around it. Denda's assessment, preserved in the archives, reflected the deep conviction of Japan's air doctrine. Battles were won not with armor or radios, but with the ability of a trained pilot to outfly his opponent. By late 1943, Japanese confidence was not arrogance in their minds. It was mathematics. Since the opening of the war, kill ratios had consistently tilted in their favor. Veteran pilots had grown accustomed to claiming 2, 3, sometimes 5 kills in a single mission, returning unscathed to base while the enemy struggled to put together replacement squadrons. Even when Allied production replaced lost aircraft, those machines fell just as quickly as their predecessors. What use was America's industrial power if every pilot they trained lasted only weeks before being cut down? On the airfields of Rabaul and Truk, this was the mood. Certainty. Certainty that the new fighter described in the intelligence report could not alter the balance. The Hellcat was simply another target, an overweight entry that would litter the seas with wreckage once it met the sharp fangs of the Zero. The war, of course, had already begun to shift in ways unseen from the vantage point of Sakai and his comrades. Beneath the surface, hidden in numbers not yet revealed to them, the tide was turning. American carriers were no longer hesitant raiders, but relentless platforms of power. Factories in New York and California were producing engines and airframes in quantities Japan could not comprehend. Pilots were being trained not as lone artists, but as parts of a coordinated system, drilled endlessly in formation, flying, communications, and energy tactics. The Hellcat, dismissed as clumsy and slow, was not built to duel in circles. It was built to fight a different war, one that Japan did not yet recognize. Yet in that moment, in the oppressive heat of New Britain, none of that mattered. Saburo Sakai closed the folder with the easy certainty of a man who believed he had already seen the enemy's best. Around him, his fellow aviators leaned back with satisfied grins, each certain that their future victories were written in advance. They trusted the Zero, and they trusted the doctrine that had carried them from triumph to triumph across 2 vast oceans. The air outside shimmered with the promise of another day's sorties. The ground crews continued their work, tightening bolts, refueling tanks, arming cannons. The Zeros waited, lined like blades of a drawn sword. The men who would fly them adjusted their flight gear, tied their scarves, and scribbled final words to families far away, not because they expected death, but because tradition demanded it. They believed the skies still belonged to them, as surely as the sun that emblazoned their wings belonged to their empire. And so the laughter at the Hellcat continued, soft and certain, carried on the damp Pacific air. They laughed because for 2 years they had been untouchable. They laughed because every opponent before had fallen. They laughed because the mathematics of air combat seemed to promise that nothing could dethrone the Zero. What they did not know, what not one man in that tent could have guessed, was that within 30 days their certainty would be shattered. The aircraft they mocked would emerged not as a clumsy brute, but as the most lethal predator the Pacific skies had ever seen. In 6 months, the men laughing now would be writing final letters home. In less than a year, the ranks of Japan's air groups would be filled with boys scarcely trained to fly, sent up against machines and pilots they could not hope to match. The Hellcat would not fight the way the Zero fought. It would not duel in graceful circles, nor would it rely on delicate maneuvers that strained the edge of physics. It would fight like a hammer, striking from above, diving with weight and speed, climbing with raw horsepower. It would carry radios that knit its pilots together into a single machine, armor that allowed them to absorb punishment and return fire, guns that spat streams of metal with overwhelming volume. And behind it all stood not just the man in the cockpit, but the weight of an entire industrial nation, a system designed for nothing less than total war. In September of 1943, none of that was visible to the pilots who still believed the Zero was eternal. They had the past to reassure them, a history of victories etched into every horizon of the Pacific. They had the mathematics of turn radius and wing loading to comfort them. They had the words of their heroes telling them that the Hellcat was heavy, awkward, doomed. The sun beat down on the steel planking of Rabaul's airstrip as another day began. The Zeros waited, engines warming, exhaust curling in the humid air. The pilots climbed aboard, laughing still, as confident as samurai striding into battle. Yet even as they laughed, history had already turned. The machine they mocked was coming for them, and it would have the last laugh. From the first strikes at Pearl Harbor the Zero carved its legend into the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier decks opened and 353 aircraft roared toward Oahu, the world saw for the first time the reach and precision of Japan's naval air arm. The Zero, light and agile, cut through American defenses with almost effortless superiority. In that attack, the Japanese Navy lost only 29 aircraft of all types, while American forces counted 347 destroyed or crippled on the ground and in the air. To Japanese aviators, the mathematics were undeniable. The new empire in the Pacific had taken flight. The months that followed seemed to confirm the Zero as a machine touched by invincibility. Over the Philippines, Japanese pilots recorded 7 losses against 103 Allied aircraft destroyed. Over Darwin, in northern Australia, 2 Zeros fell, while 30 defenders were swept away. The Royal Navy's air arm in the Far East, the pride of Britain's empire, was annihilated in weeks. The Dutch East Indies Air Forces, too, were crushed in days. In every sector of combat, the pattern repeated. Outnumbered Zeros entered battle and returned with astonishing victory ratios. The dominance was not illusion. It was recorded in reports, in wreckage, in the shifting lines of maps across the Pacific. At the center of this transformation was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero itself, an aircraft that violated what Allied engineers believed possible. In 1942, when a captured Zero was brought to American testing grounds, engineers refused at first to accept the data. A fighter that weighed less than 6,000 pounds, yet could fly more than 1,000 miles without refueling. A machine that could climb at 3,000 feet per minute and outturn biplanes while carrying cannons and machine guns. It seemed implausible. Yet the Zero delivered exactly those capabilities. And for pilots trained in Japan's rigorous pre-war system, it was the perfect weapon. The design philosophy was revolutionary because it abandoned everything the West had considered essential. Where Americans insisted on armor for the pilot, the Zero offered none. Where British engineers demanded self-sealing fuel tanks, the Zeros were thin-walled and vulnerable. Radios were removed to save weight, leaving many aircraft mute in combat. Even small elements, like cockpit instrumentation or heavy fire extinguishers, were omitted. Every ounce saved was converted into agility and range. The result was a fighter that, at the start of the war, could outfly, outclimb, and outfight anything in the sky. For Japanese pilots, the Zero was not just an aircraft, but an extension of their very identity. Men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa would become the empire's ace of aces with 87 victories, described it in almost mystical terms. In his recovered diary, he wrote, "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The machine responds to thought." To him, American fighters felt clumsy, like tools built by factories rather than extensions of the warrior. They build their aircraft as they build their cars, he wrote. Heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. The Zero, by contrast, was pure refinement, the perfect synthesis of man and machine. The early war battles reinforced this faith. At Wake Island, Japanese naval air units annihilated outnumbered defenders. In the skies above Malaya and Singapore, Zeros swept British aircraft aside as if brushing dust from a table. In the first months of 1942, Allied pilots were forced into desperate tactics, often instructed simply to dive and run if a Zero appeared on their tail. To attempt a turning engagement was suicide. The Zero owned the circle, owned the duel, owned the sky. Even as new American aircraft arrived, the P-39 Airacobra, the P-40 Warhawk, and later the F-4F Wildcat, they did little to change the equation. Allied pilots who managed to bring down a Zero often did so through luck, superior numbers, or ambush. Rarely did they win in a one-on-one duel. The Wildcat, stubby and underpowered, could not hope to turn with the sleek Japanese design. In Navy after-action reports, the advice repeated again and again: avoid the Zero in maneuver combat. Survive by speed, altitude, or escape, but never attempt to match its agility. This invincibility shaped Japanese doctrine deeply. The turning fight was the heart of every tactic. Pilots trained to exploit the aircraft's low wing loading, forcing the enemy into spirals and loops until the Zero's guns could deliver the kill. The doctrine worked because the aircraft allowed it, and because early war opponents had no counter. Dogfighting remained a personal contest, a duel of skill and will, where the superior pilot in the superior machine always emerged victorious. By mid-1942, even as the tide of war shifted at Coral Sea and Midway, the Zero's aura endured. Losses in those battles were attributed not to the aircraft, but to tactics, strategy, or sheer numbers. The aircraft itself seemed untouchable. At Guadalcanal, American Marines learned to fear the sleek silhouettes that descended from the sun. Pilots returning from sorties spoke of Zeros that seemed able to hang in the air like hawks, pivoting in impossible arcs to pour fire into fleeing targets. Each engagement deepened the legend. In Tokyo, the Imperial Naval General Staff embraced the myth with equal fervor. Intelligence officers pored over reports of Allied production, but dismissed them as irrelevant. What did it matter if America produced twice, 3 times, even 10 times as many aircraft, if each Japanese fighter achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or 10-to-1? Numbers on paper meant nothing against a warrior who could turn tighter, fly farther, and strike with greater precision. The mathematics of attrition appeared meaningless when every encounter favored the Zero. For 2 full years, this logic held. From December 1941 to the summer of 1943, the Zero's dominance was both tactical and psychological. Allied pilots entered combat already burdened with the expectation of defeat. Many spoke later of the dread that gripped them at the sight of the rising sun insignia, the red circle on white wings that had become a symbol of certain death. The myth of the Zero was as powerful as its performance, reinforcing Japanese confidence that nothing the enemy produced could alter the balance. This confidence hardened into conviction by 1943. Even as American factories shifted into wartime overdrive, churning out thousands of fighters every month, Japanese officers assured their pilots that the quality of the Zero and of the men who flew it rendered numbers irrelevant. They had proof in their logbooks, in the photographs of wrecked airfields, in the victories that stretched from Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Burma. Every battle had told the same story. The Zero was supreme. What they could not yet see was how narrow the foundations of this supremacy were. The Zero's brilliance came at terrible cost. Its lack of armor meant pilots who once survived with minor wounds now perished in flames. Its fragile fuel tanks meant that a single bullet could transform victory into fiery death. Its light construction meant it could not absorb damage the way American aircraft could, and its reliance on turning tactics assumed an enemy willing to play the same game. The Zero was invincible only so long as combat remained within the boundaries Japan itself had defined. For the men at Rabaul, in September 1943, these vulnerabilities were invisible. They saw only the record of triumph, the mathematics of victory, the numbers that seemed irrefutable. When they read reports of the American Hellcat, bloated and heavy, burdened with armor and guns, they saw not a predator, but a blunder. They could not yet imagine that the very weight they mocked would soon become the weapon that destroyed them. By the time the first Hellcats took to the skies in combat, the myth of the Zero was already so deeply ingrained in the minds of Japan's aviators that they could not conceive of its collapse. They believed themselves heirs to an unbroken chain of victories, warriors chosen by destiny and armed with the most perfect machine ever built. They had defeated every opponent before. They would defeat this one too. The truth, waiting beyond the horizon, was far harsher. The days of the Zero's invincibility were ending. Within weeks, the laughter would fade, replaced by disbelief, then dread, and finally silence. The myth that had carried Japan across the Pacific was about to meet a machine that fought by different rules, and in that meeting, the Zero's legend would shatter. Early 1943, the first whispers of a new American fighter reached Japanese intelligence offices through neutral channels. Swedish sources passed along the specifications, which were quickly circulated among naval staff. The numbers appeared exaggerated, even laughable. The aircraft in question, designated the F6F, was said to weigh more than 12,000 pounds loaded, nearly twice the Zero's weight. It carried armor plate around the pilot, bulletproof glass at the front, self-sealing fuel tanks holding over 200 gallons of fuel, and 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns with a total of 2,400 rounds. 2 Japanese planners steeped in the traditions of maneuver combat. These figures made no sense. The aircraft seemed a caricature, a flying fortress masquerading as a fighter. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the most brilliant tacticians in the Imperial Navy and the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, reviewed the reports himself. His judgment was blunt. This new fighter, he argued, represented the continuation of American mistakes. They believe weight can replace skill, he noted in his analysis. They attempt to overcome the pilot's weakness by wrapping him in steel. But war in the air is not fought with steel. It is fought with maneuver, with instinct, with precision. Zero will fly circles around it. His words carried authority. In the archives, his conclusion remains clear. The Hellcat was not a threat. The pilots in the field accepted this conclusion eagerly. They had reason to. For more than 2 years, they had flown the Zero to overwhelming success. Its statistics told a story that seemed unassailable. With a wing loading of only 22 pounds per square foot, it could complete a turn in just over 600 feet. No Allied aircraft approached that performance. The Hellcat's figures suggested a wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot and a turning radius in excess of 900 feet. To aviators who live by the doctrine of the turn, the numbers spoke for themselves. An aircraft that could not turn would not survive. The doctrine was older than the war itself. Since the Zero's introduction in China, Japanese pilots had relied on maneuver superiority to bring victories. Dogfighting was understood as a duel, a contest of skill measured in loops and circles. A pilot forced his opponent into a turning fight, then used the Zero's tighter radius to position behind him. The kill followed naturally. Allied machines, heavier and less refined, could not compete. This method had worked against the British Hurricane, the American P-40 Warhawk, the Dutch Brewster Buffalo, and the Australian Warway. It had continued to work against the newer F6F Wildcat. Time and again, Japanese squadrons returned from combat with losses counted in single digits, while the enemy's numbers were measured in dozens. The Hellcat, on paper, was simply another victim waiting its turn. Japanese pilots looked at its silhouette drawings and laughed. The fuselage was thick, the wings stubby, the engine cowling oversized. To them, it resembled a torpedo bomber armed with fighter guns. Even its radio, a large American set with trailing antenna wires, seemed unnecessary and foolish. Radios weighed precious pounds and distracted from the art of flight. True warriors relied on eyesight, instinct, and the silent understanding of formation. The Zero itself often dispensed with radios entirely. The philosophy behind the Zero was the opposite of the Hellcat's apparent design. Japanese engineers, led by Jiro Horikoshi, had stripped every ounce of excess. They used an advanced aluminum alloy, known as extra super duralumin, 30% lighter than the metals used by American designers. They sacrificed armor. They sacrificed protection. They sacrificed radios and redundancy. What remained was an aircraft so light that it seemed to move by thought alone. Its range extended beyond 1,000 miles, giving it reach over vast oceans. Its agility surpassed that of any enemy. Its climb rate allowed it to meet bombers at altitude and still fight the escorts. For 2 years, this formula had worked flawlessly. The record of victories made Japanese confidence unshakable. At Pearl Harbor, 29 aircraft lost against 347 destroyed. In the Philippines, 7 against 103. Over Darwin, 2 against 30. In the Dutch East Indies, Allied air power crushed within days. At every battlefront, the numbers favored the Zero. By mid-1943, the belief that the aircraft was unbeatable had hardened into doctrine. Even when defeats came, as at Midway, they were blamed on strategy, not on the Zero itself. The machine remained untouchable. In Tokyo, planners studied American production figures with detached calm. They knew the United States was outproducing Japan by enormous margins. American factories in 1943 were turning out thousands of fighters each month. But to the Imperial Navy, this meant little. What value were numbers if each Japanese pilot achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or 10-to-1? The mathematics of attrition did not apply when quality outweighed quantity. Japanese officers assured their squadrons that numbers alone could not change the balance of the sky. The first rumors of the Hellcat's combat debut were treated as minor curiosities. Reports of American carrier raids grew more frequent in late summer, but they were expected. For months, the U.S. Navy had launched nuisance strikes, quick raids by small groups of aircraft that fled before Japanese interceptors arrived. Nothing in these operations suggested a fundamental change. The Hellcat was present among them. Its performance was indistinguishable from that of earlier models. What Japanese intelligence did not realize was that the Hellcat had been designed with their own aircraft in mind. American engineers had studied the Zero captured in 1942, flown it, tested it, dissected it. They understood where it excelled and where it faltered. They knew it could not dive steeply without risking structural collapse. They knew its engine lost power above 20,000 feet. They knew its lack of armor meant a single hit could be fatal. The Hellcat was conceived not to imitate the Zero, but to exploit its weaknesses. Its heavy frame and powerful engine allowed it to climb and dive where the Zero could not follow. Its armor allowed its pilot to survive encounters that would have killed a Japanese aviator. Its 6 machine guns provided overwhelming firepower. The difference was philosophical as much as technical. The Zero embodied the Bushido spirit of the lone warrior, the samurai in the sky. The Hellcat embodied the American philosophy of the system. It was not built to make one man invincible. It was built to ensure that thousands of men could fight effectively, survive combat, and return to fight again. In operations tents from truck to Rabaul, none of this was visible. The reports on the Hellcat continued to circulate, and the laughter continued. Pilots reassured one another that they would defeat it as they had defeated every American design before. They pointed to the numbers, the turning radius, the weight. The Zero still held the advantage. Their confidence was absolute. Yet beneath the surface, the war had already shifted. American carriers were growing stronger. Their pilots were receiving more training hours than their Japanese counterparts could dream of. Their tactics had evolved, abandoning the turning fight in favor of slashing attacks and coordinated energy fighting. The Hellcat, unseen and untested in Japanese eyes, was waiting at the edge of the horizon. By September of 1943, its arrival was imminent. On Marcus Island, the last day of that month, Japanese pilots would finally meet it in battle. In that encounter, the numbers that had seemed so clear on paper would dissolve in the smoke of combat. The laughter would fade, replaced by something else entirely: confusion first, then fear, and eventually recognition. The Hellcat was not a mistake. It was the machine that would end the Zero's reign. September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island lay quiet in the Central Pacific, its coral airstrips bristling with fighters and bombers, its defenses prepared for the possibility of another American raid. Among the Japanese units stationed there was Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, a veteran Zero pilot. His mission that morning was routine: escort a reconnaissance aircraft on its sweep over open water. It was a task he had performed many times before, an assignment that rarely offered more than the chance to scan endless sky and sea. He trusted his machine and the doctrine that had carried him safely through months of war. The Zero was a fighter built for turning engagements, and Fukui knew how to use it. At just under 6,000 pounds fully loaded, with a wing loading that made its turning radius a mere 600 feet, it was the master of the circle fight. Against any opponent he had encountered so far, those tactics worked. If the enemy tried to follow his turn, they lost speed and drifted into his sights. If they attempted to climb, the Zero's agility allowed him to curve up behind them. That morning, as the mission began, there was no reason to believe this flight would be any different. Then he saw them, 6 dark shapes approaching from the southeast, climbing steadily toward the Japanese formation. At first glance, the silhouettes resembled medium bombers. Fukui thought of B-25s, which had been encountered before, but the size was wrong. These aircraft were large, yet their proportions suggested something else. The fuselages were broad, the wings shorter and thicker than bombers. As the distance closed, recognition struck. These were fighters. Their lines were unfamiliar, their presence unexpected. What Fukui witnessed was the combat debut of the F6F Hellcat. The intelligence reports he had heard weeks earlier came back to him in an instant: tremors of a heavy American fighter, almost twice the weight of his Zero, burdened with armor and thick glass, carrying 6 machine guns. He had dismissed the stories as exaggeration or deliberate misinformation. Now the truth presented itself in blue-painted steel, engines growling, wings tilted in climbing formation. Doctrine dictated his response. He rolled his Zero into a diving turn, expecting the American aircraft to continue forward, their heavy frames unable to match his maneuver. His plan was simple: cut across the inside of their path, tighten his circle, and bring his guns to bear on the lead fighter. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before, but the Hellcat did not follow the script. Instead of plowing straight ahead, the lead American fighter pulled up into the vertical. The maneuver was abrupt, almost unnatural for an aircraft of that size. Its nose rose toward the sky, and the bulk of the machine climbed with steady, unrelenting force. Fukui's Zero followed, engines straining. The Nakajima Sake engine, delivering 1,130 horsepower, roared at full throttle. The climb rate began to bleed away as the altitude increased. His speed dropped, his control surfaces softened. The Zero's strength was in its low wing loading and maneuverability, but in the vertical, its limitations were severe. Above him, the Hellcat showed no sign of slowing. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Zero's output. At a rate of 3,500 feet per minute, it soared upward with ease. Then, as Fukui struggled to hold his climb, the American fighter executed a hammerhead turn at the top. The maneuver brought its nose swinging down in a sharp arc, and suddenly the Hellcat was behind him. The situation reversed in an instant. Fukui had expected to be the hunter. Now he was prey. At a distance of 400 meters, the Hellcat opened fire. 6 50 caliber machine guns spat a storm of lead, each Browning M2 heavy machine gun firing 750 rounds per minute. In 3 seconds, the air was filled with destruction. Bullets tore through Fukui's Zero. 17 impacts ripped into his wings, fuselage, and tail. The lightweight construction that gave the Zero its agility also made it fragile. Holes appeared across the aircraft. The engine coughed. Smoke filled the cockpit. Fukui fought to save himself. He threw his Zero into a deliberate spin, a maneuver that disoriented attackers and bled altitude rapidly. The violent descent disrupted the Hellcat's aim, and by chance or skill, he escaped further fire. When he recovered from the spin, his aircraft shuddered with damage but remained flyable. He turned back toward Marcus Island, nursing the crippled fighter home. His wingman, Petty Officer 2nd Class Massa, was not so lucky. Caught in the Hellcat's sights, his Zero exploded into flame and spiraled into the sea. The reconnaissance plane they were escorting was also destroyed. The mission, intended as routine, ended in disaster. Fukui's after-action report recorded the experience with stark detail. First encounter with F6F type fighter. He wrote, "Initial impression: Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. Engaged with standard tactics. Unexpected result. Enemy climbed vertically with great power. Performed maneuver impossible for its weight. Opened fire with 6 guns. Volume unprecedented. My aircraft struck 17 times, escaped only by spin." The meaning of the report was clear. For the first time, a Japanese pilot admitted that the familiar tactics had failed. The Hellcat had refused the turning fight. It had exploited the vertical, a domain where the Zero could not follow. It had brought firepower that dwarfed anything the Japanese had yet faced. The significance of this single encounter extended far beyond Marcus Island. It revealed that the Americans had built an aircraft designed not to imitate Japanese strengths, but to counter their weaknesses. The Hellcat did not try to outturn the Zero. It did not attempt to duel in circles. Instead, it used power and altitude, speed and weight to dictate the terms of combat. Where the Zero relied on agility, the Hellcat relied on energy. The Japanese pilots who read Fukui's report found it troubling. Some dismissed it as an isolated incident, the product of chance or inexperience. Others recognized its implications. The Hellcat's climb and firepower were as described. Then the balance of the air war might be shifting. Yet in the ready rooms and tents of the Pacific Islands, confidence remained. The Zero had triumphed too often to be dethroned by a single encounter. For Fukui himself, the lesson was personal. He had returned alive, his Zero riddled with holes, his pride shaken, but his skill intact. He had seen the new enemy, and he had survived. But he knew survival owed more to fortune than superiority. His wingman had not come back. The reconnaissance crew had perished. The Americans had drawn first blood. In the weeks that followed, similar reports would surface from other fronts. The Hellcat, once dismissed as a mistake of design, began to appear with growing frequency. Each engagement left traces wrecked Zeros, dead pilots, stories of American fighters climbing where none should have climbed, diving with speeds no Zero could match, and firing storms of bullets that shredded the fragile Japanese airframes. The encounter at Marcus Island marked the opening of a new phase in the Pacific Air War. It was the moment when the myth of invincibility began to fracture. The Zero, once supreme, had met an opponent that refused to play by the old rules. The mathematics of turn radius and wing loading no longer guaranteed victory. The doctrines drilled into Japanese pilots since the 1930s began to falter. For the Americans, the engagement proved the Hellcat's worth. The design philosophy had been validated in combat. Armor kept pilots alive. Radios allowed coordination. Firepower destroyed opponents quickly. Engine power gave freedom of maneuver. In the clash over Marcus Island, the Hellcat had shown itself to be more than a match for the Zero. The Japanese would not yet admit defeat. Their confidence ran deep, their faith in the Zero still strong. But the memory of Marcus Island lingered. It stood as a warning that the skies of the Pacific were changing. And for the pilots who had laughed at the Hellcat only weeks earlier, the sound of that laughter began to fade, replaced by the silence of men who had seen a new reality with their own eyes. The first blood belonged to the Hellcat. October 5, 1943. Task Force 14 advanced on Wake Island, launching a raid that at first appeared no different from countless earlier American strikes. For months, the U.S. Navy had sent carrier aircraft to harass Japanese bases across the Pacific. These raids were often small, quick, and designed to test defenses. Japanese squadrons had grown accustomed to the pattern. The enemy would attack, then withdraw before serious interception could occur. For Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga of the 252nd Air Group, the morning began with the expectation of another routine defense. Yet this time, when his squadron of 12 Zeros climbed to meet the intruders, the encounter would mark a turning point in the air war. The Japanese fighters rose to 20,000 feet, holding every advantage. They had the altitude, the position of attack, and the element of surprise. Below them, 12 American fighters flew in 3 neat divisions. Shiga recorded in his diary that victory seemed certain. By every calculation, the Japanese formation should have swept the Americans from the sky. In numbers, skill, and tactical position, the Zeros were favored. The pilots believed they would descend like hawks on helpless prey. As the Zeros dove, the Americans did not scatter. They did not turn to fight in circles. Instead, the Hellcats maintained formation, diving gently to preserve speed and energy. Shiga's men opened fire from maximum range, expecting the weight of fire to cripple at least one enemy aircraft before the clash closed. But the results were startling. The American planes simply absorbed the punishment. The Hellcat's armor was decisive. The pilots sat behind 200 pounds of steel plate. 110 more protected the oil system. Bulletproof glass shielded the cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks could take repeated hits without igniting. Japanese rounds that would have shredded a Zero instead sparked against steel and vanished into reinforced compartments. As the Zeros pulled up from their dives to circle back, the Hellcats counterattacked. They did not turn to dogfight. Instead, they used speed and weight. Climbing at full throttle, their powerful engines kept them strong even at high altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 still delivered more than 1,600 horsepower at 25,000 feet. By comparison, the Zero's Nakajima Sake engine sagged to barely 900 horsepower in the thin air. Shiga later wrote, "They came down on us like hawks on sparrows. Their weight gave them speed we could not match. They would dive, fire those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could react. Each pass left wreckage." The Zeros, forced into turning maneuvers that bled their energy, could not regain position before another Hellcat swept down from above. The results were catastrophic. 8 Zeros were destroyed. None of the Hellcats were lost. For the first time, an engagement had produced a lopsided exchange in the Americans' favor. The Japanese doctrine of the turn had failed completely. The weight of the Hellcat, once mocked, now revealed itself as advantage. Its mass gave it momentum in dives, speed in slashing attacks, and stability in climbs. Its armor allowed pilots to fight aggressively, confident they could survive hits. The 6 heavy machine guns offered firepower unmatched in Japanese squadrons. Together, these factors formed a system the Zeros could not counter. The battle at Wake Island echoed quickly across Japanese units. Reports described an enemy fighter that refused to enter turning contests. Instead, it used energy fighting tacking from high speed, firing bursts, then climbing away beyond reach. To the Japanese pilots trained in duels of agility, this was disorienting. Their instincts told them to turn tighter, to force the enemy into circles. But the Hellcat never followed. It dictated combat from above, reducing the Zero's strengths to irrelevance. The doctrine the Americans employed had a name: Bumanzoom. In Japanese reports, it became known simply as execution. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tenemizu, one of the few aces to survive multiple encounters with the Hellcat, explained it to his men later that year. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he said. "The Americans do not fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors. They attack, kill, and leave. There is no duel, there is no honor. There is only death from above." The contrast in technology widened the gap further. The Hellcat's 6 Brownings fired a combined 4,500 rounds per minute. Each 50 caliber bullet carried 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. By comparison, The Zero's 7.7mm machine guns fired lighter rounds at lower velocity, delivering only 750 foot-pounds of energy. Even with its 20mm cannons, the Zero's firepower was far lighter in volume. Against unarmored opponents, it had been sufficient. Against Hellcats, it was inadequate. Radar further tilted the balance. While Japanese pilots still relied on visual spotting, the Americans were guided into position by controllers aboard their carriers. Shipboard radar detected Japanese aircraft 50 miles away, vectored Hellcats into perfect interception courses, and allowed them to begin battles with advantage. To Japanese aviators, this seemed uncanny. Lieutenant Sadamo Kumachi described his first radar-directed encounter. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. They came diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. It was as if they knew our every move." By late 1943, these encounters multiplied. Every clash revealed the same pattern. The Zero could not outclimb the Hellcat. It could not outdive it. It could not absorb punishment. It could not survive the vertical. The only advantage it retained was turn radius, but the Americans simply refused to play that game. The pilot equation compounded the crisis. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators had trained for 3 years, logging more than 700 flight hours before combat. They were masters of aerobatics and gunnery, steeped in the philosophy of individual skill. By 1943, however, losses and shortages had forced training standards down. New pilots arrived at the front with 300 hours, sometimes fewer. Many had never fired their guns in flight. Some had never flown at night. In contrast, American pilots received standardized training of 300 hours minimum, including 50 in type, with extensive live-fire practice. They learned energy fighting in safe conditions over American airfields. When they entered combat, they were prepared for the doctrine the Hellcat demanded. The Wake Island battle symbolized more than one lopsided exchange. It marked the beginning of systematic reversal. Japanese pilots, once confident of superiority, now faced a machine that nullified their tactics. The Hellcat was not invincible, but it was consistent. It could fight at high altitude, dive at speeds the Zero could not match, and withstand damage that would have destroyed Japanese fighters. It allowed American pilots to dictate when and how to engage. 8 Zeros lost for no American casualties. It was not yet the annihilation of later battles, but it was enough to prove that the old order was ending. The myth of the Zero's dominance, built on 2 years of victory, began to crumble. Pilots who had once laughed at the Hellcat now carried doubts. Reports from survivors spread unease. Commanders began to reconsider tactics, but the fundamental imbalance of technology and doctrine could not be corrected quickly. The Hellcat's arrival changed the mathematics of war. Victory was no longer measured by individual duels, but by systems: radar control, coordinated formations, disciplined energy fighting. American pilots flew not as lone samurai, but as parts of a machine that stretched from the factory to the carrier deck. The weight of the Hellcat symbolized that system. Every pound of armor, every gallon of fuel, every bullet carried was part of an industrial design that prioritized survival and efficiency. The Japanese had believed that weight was weakness. At Wake Island, they discovered it was strength. The Hellcat turned its mass into momentum, its engine into altitude, its armor into staying power. It fought not to outmaneuver, but to outlast and overpower. For pilots like Shiga and his men, the revelation came at the cost of lives. For the Imperial Navy, it was a harbinger of the disasters to come. By the end of 1943, encounters like Wake Island would repeat across the Pacific. Each time, more Zeros fell, more experienced pilots were lost, and the advantage shifted further. The Hellcat was no longer a rumor or a joke. It was a reality, one that could not be ignored. The laughter of September had died in October smoke. The age of the Zero was ending, and the Hellcat was writing its obituary with fire and steel. By November of 1943, the reports coming back from the front lines told a story Japan had not expected to hear. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was no longer dictating the terms of battle. The new American fighter, the F6F Hellcat, had appeared in strength, and with it came a style of combat that Japanese pilots could neither predict nor counter. At Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanamizu, a seasoned ace credited with 32 victories, assembled a group of younger pilots in the mess hall for an urgent briefing. The men respected him as one of the few survivors of repeated encounters with the Hellcat. His expression carried no trace of the confidence that had once defined Japan's naval aviators. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners. They do not duel, they kill, and they leave. That is all." His words cut to the heart of the transformation. For years, Japanese training had revolved around the concept of the turning fight. The Zero's extraordinary maneuverability allowed it to dominate in horizontal engagements, forcing enemies into spirals and loops until they stalled or drifted helplessly into its guns. Every Japanese pilot had been raised on that doctrine. Victory came from outturning the enemy, from pressing close, from matching skill against skill in the sky. But the Hellcat refused to play that game. It did not turn tightly, did not attempt to duel in circles. Instead, it climbed into the vertical, or it dove with crushing speed, and it struck in short, devastating bursts. Its pilots were trained in energy fighting, a doctrine that treated altitude and speed as currency. They entered combat with reserves of both, spent them in slashing attacks, and escaped before a Zero could respond. Then they repeated the process. It was not a contest of artistry, but a mechanical system of advantage, applied relentlessly. The difference was magnified by technology. The Hellcat carried radios in every cockpit. Japanese pilots had dismissed radios for years as unnecessary weight, a distraction for the pilot, an indulgence of Western over-engineering. Many Zeros flew without them at all. Communication in combat relied on visual signals, wing waggles, hand gestures, or simple instinct. In contrast, the Hellcat pilots spoke constantly to one another and to controllers far below. They coordinated attacks, warned of threats, and set traps that individual Japanese pilots never saw coming. Tanimizu explained to his men what this meant. "You fight one Hellcat, but you are already in the sights of another. Their radios make them a single weapon. We fight as samurai. They fight as a machine." The disparity in firepower was even more alarming. Japanese mechanics examined Zeros that returned from battle, counting the holes torn through their frames. The conclusion was always the same. The Hellcat S6 Browning M2 machine guns spat destruction on a scale the Zero could not match. Each weapon fired at 750 rounds per minute. Together, they delivered 4,500 rounds every 60 seconds. A 3-second burst could unleash more than 200 bullets, each weighing 46 grams and traveling at nearly 2,900 feet per second. The energy of each round was over 3,000 foot-pounds, enough to tear through the light duralumin skin of the Zero and shred its fragile frame. The Zero's armament had been formidable when it entered service. Two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns were sufficient to destroy the unarmored Allied aircraft of 1941 and 1942. But the limitations were becoming fatal. The cannons carried limited ammunition. The machine guns, firing much lighter bullets, lacked the striking power to penetrate the Hellcat's armor. In a duel of endurance, the Zero's weapons were overwhelmed by the Hellcat's volume of fire. Pilots reported firing long bursts into American fighters with little effect, while their own aircraft disintegrated under the torrent of 50-caliber rounds. Radar widened the gulf further. From the decks of their carriers, American controllers directed Hellcats with uncanny accuracy. They could detect Japanese formations at distances of 50 miles, calculate altitude and heading, and place fighters in position for ambushes. Two Japanese pilots, accustomed to relying on eyesight alone, this seemed almost supernatural. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi described one such encounter in chilling detail. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. They came from above, perfectly aligned on our course, as if they could see through the sky itself." For the Japanese, these experiences were disorienting. Combat had always been understood as a duel between men, an exchange of skill where the better pilot in the better machine prevailed. Now they faced opponents who seemed to arrive from nowhere, coordinated by unseen hands, attacking in pairs or divisions with flawless timing. Even when individual Japanese pilots fought with courage and precision, they were cut down by a system that multiplied the strength of every Hellcat in the air. The philosophy behind the two aircraft revealed the cultural divide. The Zero was the embodiment of Bushido in the air. It was light, elegant, and deadly in the hands of a master. But it offered no protection. Its pilot was expected to accept risk, to sacrifice himself if necessary. Every ounce of weight saved for maneuverability was taken from survivability. The Hellcat represented a different vision. It was heavy, armored, and designed not for elegance, but for endurance. It was not a duelist's weapon, but a soldier's. It allowed its pilot to survive mistakes, to take hits and keep fighting, to return to the carrier and fly again the next day. By late 1943, the consequences of these differences became catastrophic. Japan's pre-war training program had been among the most rigorous in the world. Navy pilots spent 3 years in preparation, logging more than 700 flight hours before entering combat. They emerged as aerial artists, capable of wringing every ounce of performance from the zero. But war had consumed that generation. Attrition stripped squadrons of their veterans. By 1943, replacements arrived with barely 300 hours of flight time, sometimes less. Fuel shortages forced training in gliders. Ammunition shortages meant many had never fired their weapons in practice. The Americans, meanwhile, expanded their programs. Each new pilot completed a minimum of 300 hours, including dozens in the Hellcat itself. They practiced gunnery with thousands of rounds, drilled carrier landings until they were automatic, and learned energy tactics in safe conditions over American airfields. When they arrived in combat, they were not as instinctive as the Japanese veterans of 1941, but they were disciplined, consistent, and coordinated. The imbalance grew with every month. At Truk Lagoon in December 1943, Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had once led the Pearl Harbor strike, inspected damaged Zeros and admitted the truth. The gulf in technology was beyond repair. His reports cataloged the evidence: firepower unmatched, armor unbreakable, coordination flawless, radar guidance impossible to counter. Japan's aviation, he concluded, could not close the gap. For the pilots in the field, this realization came not from reports but from lived experience. They took off confident in the Zero's agility and returned, if they returned at all, with holes stitched across their wings and tails, their friends missing. Survivors wrote of battles that no longer felt like duels. They felt like exterminations, conducted methodically by an opponent who never exposed himself to equal terms. Tanimisu put it bluntly to his men: "We are not fighting pilots. We are fighting a machine. Each Hellcat is one part of a system. That system cannot be outturned or outflown. It must be endured, and endurance is death." By the end of 1943, the truth was undeniable. The Hellcat had established itself as more than just another fighter. It was the centerpiece of an industrial method of warfare that Japan could not match. The Zero still flew, still fought, still claimed victories when circumstances allowed. But the balance had shifted. Battles that once ended with 5-to-1 kill ratios in Japan's favor now ended in the Americans' favor. Where Japanese pilots had once laughed at the Hellcat's weight, they now spoke of it with dread. The age of the samurai in the sky was closing. The age of the machine had begun. By the beginning of 1944, the crisis facing Japan's air arm was no longer theoretical. It was visible in every sortie, every combat report, every returning pilot who staggered out of a riddled cockpit or failed to return at all. The Zero had entered the war as the symbol of Japanese mastery of the skies. 3 years later, it was being systematically dismantled by the Hellcat and by the industrial and doctrinal system that stood behind it. The change was first measured not in machinery, but in men. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had invested extraordinary time and resources into its aviators. Training took 3 years. Candidates were screened with ruthless intensity. Only the best survived the program, and those who did graduated with more than 700 flight hours. They were experts in aerobatics, sharpshooting, and navigation. They could handle the Zero as if it were an extension of their own bodies. When they entered combat in 1941, they were the most skilled naval aviators in the world. But war is attrition. By 1943, the ranks of those pre-war elites had thinned alarmingly. Battles at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and Rabaul had claimed irreplaceable veterans. Every lost pilot represented not just an individual, but years of training that Japan no longer had the resources to replicate. The replacement pipeline faltered. Fuel shortages bit first. Japan's oil imports had been slashed by submarine warfare and Allied advances. Aviation fuel became precious. Training flights were curtailed. Gliders replaced powered aircraft in basic programs. Pilots who once practiced endless gunnery passes now received only a handful of live rounds before being sent to the front. Night flying, instrument training, formation, practice all were cut. By early 1944, Navy trainees graduated with just 300 hours of flight time. Army pilots often had only 200. The effects were immediate. Inexperienced pilots arrived at frontline bases ill-prepared for modern combat. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report, "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. "We have no ammunition for practice." He had never flown at night. "We have no fuel for such training." He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. 7 minutes. That was the measure of Japan's collapse in pilot quality. Against Hellcats flown by Americans who had received structured training, drilled in gunnery with thousands of practice rounds, and prepared for energy tactics, the new Japanese pilots stood no chance. The disparity grew wider with every encounter. In October 1943, during the Battle of Formosa, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome committed more than 700 aircraft in a desperate attempt to stop American carrier raids. Among them were many of the last pilots drawn from Japan's homeland training squadrons. The results were catastrophic. Japanese propaganda claimed spectacular victories. 26 carriers and battleships sunk, 300 American aircraft destroyed. But the reality, revealed when gun camera footage was developed, told a different story. Actual American losses amounted to just 89 aircraft. Japanese losses were 329 aircraft, nearly half the force committed, along with irreplaceable aircrew. For men like Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few surviving veterans, the battle was seared into memory. In his memoirs, he described the slaughter. "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below us. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division." It was not combat. It was systematic extermination. The scale of loss at Formosa was unprecedented, but it reflected a pattern already entrenched. The Americans no longer met Japanese aircraft in equal terms. Their radar gave early warning. Their Hellcats climbed to intercept at altitude. Their formations operated in disciplined sections of 2 and 4, overlapping coverage so that no attacker escaped. Japanese doctrine, built on the lone warrior and the supremacy of the turn, disintegrated under this pressure. By early 1944, Japan's air groups were collapsing from within. Units once staffed by hardened aces were now filled with recruits barely competent to keep formation. The Zero, a machine designed to amplify the skill of a master, became a coffin in the hands of the inexperienced. Its lack of armor, once an acceptable risk in the hands of a veteran, now meant young pilots died in their first combat. Its lack of radios left them isolated. Its agility was useless when faced with coordinated slashing attacks from above. The American side of the equation told the opposite story. New Hellcat pilots arrived with 300 hours minimum, including 50 in type. They had practiced carrier landings until they were routine. They had fired thousands of rounds in training. They had rehearsed energy tactics against instructors flying simulated Zeros. By the time they joined a carrier air group, they were already comfortable with the Hellcat's capabilities. And unlike Japanese rookies, they were supported by veterans. American squadrons maintained experienced corps, with aces mentoring newcomers. Each engagement sharpened skills further. Survivors returned, trained more, and flew again. The contrast in attrition was devastating. American losses, though real, were sustainable. Pilots shot down often survived thanks to armor, self-sealing tanks, and rescue networks at sea. Japanese pilots rarely returned. When a Zero burned, it burned completely. Even if the pilot survived the crash, the Empire had no capacity to rescue him from the ocean or jungle. Each loss was final. The collapse in the skies was statistical as much as tactical. By mid-1944, kill ratios in the Pacific averaged 10-1 in America's favor. In some battles, they exceeded 15-1. The Zero's reputation as an unbeatable predator had become an illusion. Its pilots slaughtered by a system that turned war into arithmetic. Commanders tried to adapt. Some urged abandoning the turn fight, instructing pilots to use hit-and-run tactics to dive and climb rather than circle. But such doctrine required training and coordination, luxuries Japan no longer possessed. Young pilots thrown into combat reverted instinctively to what little they had been taught. Turn, tighten, dogfight. Against Hellcats, it was suicide. The effect spread beyond tactics to morale. Surviving veterans began to describe a psychological weight they called Hellcat shock. Facing the new American fighter, meant facing an opponent who could not be shaken by traditional maneuvers. Loops, rolls, spin tricks that had once saved lives were now countered with ease. Pilots returned, shaken, writing in diaries of an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. By spring of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed an effective offensive air arm. The surviving Zero groups were bled white. Each raid cost them more aircraft than they could replace. Each new training class sent to the front was smaller, younger, less prepared. The collapse was visible not just in numbers, but in the quality of combat. Reports spoke of squadrons disintegrating in minutes, of formations shattered before they could fire a shot. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would make this collapse undeniable. But the process had already been underway for months. The shift from mastery to desperation was complete. Japan had begun the war with the finest aviators in the world, flying the most advanced fighter of its time. By 1944, they were sending boys with glider experience into cockpits to face an enemy who fought not as lone warriors, but as parts of a machine. The Zero's legend had been built on fragile assumptions that enemies would fight in circles. That armor was unnecessary. That skill alone could overcome numbers. The Hellcat proved every one of those assumptions false. In the new air war, survival mattered more than elegance, firepower mattered more than maneuver, and systems mattered more than individuals. The Japanese had brought swords to a battlefield of guns, and the result was inevitable. By the middle of 1944, fewer than 20% of Japan's naval aviators from 1941 remained alive. Those who survived watched squadrons of rookies go up against the Hellcats and vanish. They knew the collapse was total. The skies of the Pacific, once ruled by the Red Sun, now belonged to the blue-painted fighters of America. The empire that had begun the war with supremacy in the air now faced extinction in that very domain. The collapse in the skies was not sudden, but relentless. Each battle chipped away another piece of Japan's strength until only fragments remained. And in those fragments lay the truth. The Zero's reign was finished. The Hellcat had ended it. June 1944. The Philippine Sea stretched across the horizon, blue water glittering under a tropical sun. The Japanese Navy prepared for what they called Operation Ago. The decisive battle meant to halt the inexorable American advance across the Pacific. For the Imperial Command, this was to be the moment when Japan's carriers, rebuilt after years of attrition, would deliver a crushing blow. For the aviators, it was another chance to prove that the spirit of the Zero could still dominate the sky. Against them stood Task Force 58 of the U.S. Navy, the largest carrier force ever assembled, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher. At its core were 15 carriers launching more than 950 aircraft. Nearly half of those were F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, leading the Japanese mobile fleet, believed his forces still held critical advantages. His carriers launched 450 aircraft. The Zero remained the primary fighter, though newer models like the A6M5 had been introduced with modest improvements. Japanese pilots trained to exploit their aircraft's range, hoping to strike American carriers from distances beyond which they could retaliate. Ozawa trusted that superior tactics, long-range flying, and surprise would restore balance. But the assumptions underpinning his plan were already flawed. American radar detected his first wave of aircraft more than 150 miles from the fleet. Controllers aboard carriers tracked altitude and bearing, vectoring Hellcat squadrons into interception positions with perfect precision. Instead, they found the skies above the Philippine Sea filled with climbing Hellcats, layered in formations from 20,000 to 30,000 feet. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading a formation of escort fighters, later described the sight. They were stacked like a steel curtain, wave upon wave, waiting for us. We were at 18,000 feet. They had the sun and the altitude. Every advantage was theirs. His words captured the imbalance. Japanese pilots were entering a battle already lost before the first shot was fired. At 8:30 on June 19th, the first Japanese strike of 69 aircraft approached the American fleet. Hellcats met them minutes before they could descend on the carriers. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. By the end, 42 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Only a handful broke through to attack the American ships, and those caused no serious damage. Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15, personally shot down 7 aircraft that day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, downed 6. Reports noted how Japanese pilots tried to turn with the Hellcats, falling into old habits only to stall out and be picked apart one by one. The second wave fared no better. 70 aircraft launched, and radar again gave early warning. Hellcats intercepted them at range. 50 more Japanese planes fell, many without ever sighting a carrier. By mid-afternoon, 2 additional waves were launched. Each was shredded before reaching its targets. One after another, the formations disintegrated in the face of coordinated American defense. By the end of the day, Japanese losses were staggering. 346 carrier aircraft destroyed, plus 50 more land-based aircraft committed in support. American losses totaled just 30 aircraft from all causes in combat, others from accidents or ditchings after fuel ran out. The kill ratio was more than 10-1 in the Americans' favor. For the U.S. pilots, the slaughter was so one-sided, they dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name stuck, a grim reflection of the helplessness of the Japanese aviators who had once ruled the skies. The details from gun camera footage and after-action reports confirmed what many already suspected. The Zero's design, revolutionary in 1940, had become obsolete. Its lack of armor left pilots exposed. Its engine could not sustain high-altitude performance. Its weapons were too light, its ammunition too limited. Against coordinated Hellcat formations guided by radar, it was prey. The Japanese pilots themselves recognized the futility. Survivors described the battles as massacres. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Igusa, one of the veteran leaders, later told comrades it was not war. It was extermination. They came from above, from every direction. We could not reach them. We could not escape them. It was the end. For Admiral Ozawa, the losses were devastating. His carriers still floated, but they were hollow. Aircraft that had taken months to produce and pilots trained at great cost were gone in a single day. Without air cover, the Japanese fleet was exposed. When American submarines and carrier bombers struck in the days that followed, they sank 3 carriers outright. Ozawa withdrew, his strike force crippled beyond recovery. The impact on Japanese aviation was total. In the space of hours, the cream of the remaining air groups had been annihilated. Training programs had already been rushed and stripped of quality. Now the few veterans who remained were scattered, unable to mentor replacements. For the Imperial Navy, the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the effective end of its carrier aviation. The force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor was destroyed, not by ships sinking in port, but by fighters falling from the sky in flames. For the Americans, the Turkey Shoot validated the Hellcat beyond doubt. Pilots praised its ruggedness, firepower, and forgiving handling. It absorbed punishment that would have killed them in other aircraft. It turned rookies into survivors, giving them the margin to learn in combat and grow into veterans. The Hellcat's design philosophy 08, power, survivability, had proven superior to the Zero's elegance and fragility. The psychological effect was equally profound. American aviators returned from the battle rooms, confident that the enemy could no longer challenge them. Their ready rooms echoed with stories of Japanese fighters falling like game birds. Their maneuvers predictable, their pilots inexperienced. The Hellcat had not just won a battle, it had crushed the myth of the Zero forever. For Japan, the psychological collapse was severe. Surviving pilots wrote of despair, of watching entire formations vanish in minutes. They called it Hellcat psychosis, a dread that spread among air groups as they realized that encountering the F6F meant near certain death. The old assurances that skill and spirit could overcome machines were no longer credible. The battlefield had become a place where technology, coordination, and numbers dictated survival. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked a watershed in the Pacific War. After it, Japan no longer possessed the ability to contest American air superiority at sea. Its carriers, even if refitted, could not field viable air groups. Its pilots, even if trained, could not match the experience or numbers of their American counterparts. The Empire's doctrine of decisive battle at sea, nurtured for decades, had been rendered obsolete in a single day. Admiral Mitcher, reflecting on the victory, understood its significance. With the Hellcat, he said, carriers were no longer vulnerable platforms. They were fortresses. Let them come, he remarked. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience. His words encapsulated the transformation of naval warfare. Once, carriers had been weapons of surprise, striking first to survive. Now, shielded by Hellcats, they could remain in enemy waters indefinitely, confident that nothing could break their defensive umbrella. By the time the smoke cleared, the numbers told the story. 396 Japanese aircraft lost compared to 30 American. Kill ratios in some squadrons exceeded 20-1. Pilots like McCampbell and Rushing added aces tallies in a single day. These lessons hardened the system further, ensuring the next battle would be even more one-sided. Carrier aviation, once the Empire's greatest weapon, no longer existed as an effective force. The Hellcat had swept it from the sky, leaving only fragments behind. The Zero, the symbol of a rising power, now lay broken on the waters of the Philippine Sea. October 1944. The largest naval battle in history erupted across the Philippines. As the Japanese Navy launched its last desperate gamble to destroy American carrier power, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was meant to halt the U.S. invasion of the Philippines and restore a measure of strategic balance. Instead, it became the stage for the complete collapse of Japanese naval aviation. At its heart was the performance of the Hellcat, now the undisputed master of the Pacific skies. The Japanese committed everything. 4 carrier groups sailed, joined by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a vast, complex plan designed to lure American forces away and strike the invasion fleet. On paper, it was formidable. In practice, it was hollow. The Japanese carriers that sailed into battle carried air groups that were little more than shells of their former strength. The veterans had been lost months earlier at the Philippine Sea. Their replacements were raw, hastily trained, and poorly equipped. Many had fewer than 100 flight hours, some barely more than 50. Facing them were the carriers of Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet and Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. Protected by swarms of Hellcats, the numbers alone told the imbalance: 450 Japanese aircraft against nearly 1,000 American, with more than 500 Hellcats forming the backbone of fighter defenses. Every sortie, every interception, every clash magnified the disparity that had already been proven at the Marianas. On the morning of October 24, 1944, Japanese aircraft launched wave after wave against the American fleet. They came in at low altitude, high altitude, singly, and in groups, trying to break through the steel curtain of defenders. Each time, they found Hellcats waiting. Guided by radar, vectored into perfect intercept positions, the blue-painted fighters rose from their carriers like a wall. Among the men flying that morning was Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex. McCampbell was already an ace, respected for his skill and calm leadership. What followed would make him a legend. At 10 a.m., McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, spotted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft heading directly for the American fleet. Without hesitation, the 2 Hellcats engaged. What followed was one of the most remarkable individual performances in the history of aerial combat. McCampbell dove into the formation, guns blazing. His 6 Brownings shredded the first Zero in a burst that sent it spiraling into the sea. Rolling into a climb, he looped around and came down again, tearing into a bomber. One by one, he cut through the formation, conserving ammunition, firing only when certain of a hit. By the end of the 90-minute battle, he had shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros, and 4 bombers. His wingman Rushing destroyed 6 more. Together, 2 Hellcats had routed a force of 6. 15 Japanese planes lay scattered in wreckage across the sea. Not a single American ship was touched. Not a single Hellcat was lost. McCampbell's action was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of the Hellcat's dominance. Throughout the battle, similar stories unfolded. Small groups of Hellcats intercepted waves of attackers, breaking them apart with ruthless efficiency. Many Japanese pilots never even saw their targets before being shot down. The combination of radar guidance, superior aircraft performance, and disciplined energy fighting rendered them helpless. In the skies over Leyte Gulf, the imbalance of training became undeniable. Japanese pilots entered combat with almost no live-fire experience. Some had never fired their guns in flight before their first mission. Others had never flown in formation beyond basic training patterns. Against them, American pilots flew in pairs and divisions, coordinating by radio, maintaining mutual support, and striking in sequences that overwhelmed any attempt at defense. The contrast was not only tactical, but material. The Hellcat could absorb punishment and return. Reports from WWII describe Hellcats landing with dozens of bullet holes, fuel tanks leaking but sealed, pilots shaken but alive. By comparison, a single burst into a Zero's wing or fuselage often ignited flames that consumed the pilot instantly. Survivability became the decisive advantage. Every Hellcat that returned could fight again the next day. Every Zero that fell meant another irreplaceable loss for Japan. By the end of October 24th, American fighter pilots had claimed more than 200 victories. Mick Campbell's 9 made him the Navy's ace of aces, with 34 confirmed kills over the course of the war. His Medal of Honor citation would later describe the battle as a one-man assault against overwhelming odds, though in truth, it was a testament not just to his skill, but to the system that placed him in that position with every advantage. The Battle of Leyte Gulf also marked the birth of a new, desperate tactic, the kamikaze. For the first time, Japanese pilots deliberately turned their aircraft into guided missiles, diving into American ships with bombs still attached. The choice was not a matter of preference, but necessity. Conventional attacks had failed utterly. The Hellcats intercepted and destroyed so many attackers that few ever reached their targets. For Japanese commanders, the arithmetic was undeniable. If their pilots were going to die anyway, better to die by crashing into an American carrier than by being shot down uselessly at a distance. On October 25th, the first organized kamikaze mission struck. Led by Lieutenant Yukio Saki, Zeros plunged into the decks of American ships, sinking the escort carrier USS St. Lo and damaging several others. But even here, the Hellcats blunted the threat. Radar-directed interceptions destroyed the majority of kamikaze attackers before they reached their targets. Of the 47 planes launched in the first mission, only a handful broke through. The rest fell to fighters waiting along their approach paths. Hellcats now fought not only for air superiority, but for the survival of the fleet itself. Pilots developed new tactics, flying in tight four-plane formations dubbed the mowing machine. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, one of the top Navy aces, described it. "We would spread 100 yards apart, fly in a line abreast, and sweep through the enemy formation at high speed. Each pilot covered his sector. Nothing got through. Then we would climb back to altitude and do it again." Against kamikazes, these tactics proved devastatingly effective. The mathematics of Leyte Gulf confirmed the futility of Japan's position. Across the 4 days of battle, the Japanese Navy lost more than 400 aircraft. The Americans lost just over 100. But the ratio in air-to-air combat was far worse, often exceeding 12-1. Hellcats accounted for the majority of these victories, maintaining the staggering 19-1 kill ratio they had achieved since entering service. The Japanese Navy's carrier force, once the pride of the empire, was annihilated. 4 carriers were sunk, along with 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More significant than the ships, however, was the destruction of the last remnants of Japan's trained naval aviators. By the end of October 1944, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained in the entire force. The Hellcat had not only dominated the skies, but ensured the destruction of Japan's strategic doctrine. Carriers without air groups were useless. Aircraft without trained pilots were suicidal. The empire that had begun the war with the world's most feared naval aviation arm ended Leyte Gulf with nothing but desperation. The kamikaze, born in those days, was an admission of total inferiority. For American pilots, the battle cemented their confidence. The Hellcat was not glamorous. It lacked the sleek lines of the Zero or the reputation of the Mustang in Europe. But in the Pacific, it had proven itself the supreme weapon. Pilots returned to their carriers with kill counts unimaginable 2 years earlier. Entire squadrons claimed double-digit victories in a single day. The stories filled ready rooms and newspapers, boosting morale at home and demoralizing the enemy abroad. For Japan, the psychological collapse was complete. Survivors of the kamikaze missions wrote in diaries of hopelessness. One noted, "We do not fight anymore. We die. The Americans fight with machines, with numbers, with power. We have nothing left." By the close of October 1944, the Pacific Air War had reached its tipping point. The Hellcat had destroyed not only aircraft, but an entire philosophy of combat. The Japanese belief in the supremacy of skill, sacrifice, and spirit had been reduced to ash. In its place stood the cold arithmetic of industrial war, where survival, firepower, and coordination determined victory. The record of Leyte Gulf spoke for itself. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese planes in a single engagement, but Campbell alone had destroyed 9. Across the battle, Hellcats prevented hundreds of attackers from ever reaching their targets, and when they did, the damage was contained. The empire that had begun the war with laughter at America's heavy, clumsy designs now watched its last hopes vanish beneath the guns of those very machines. The Hellcat had not just defended carriers and invasion fleets. It had buried the last remnants of Japanese naval aviation in the waters off Leyte. By early 1945, the once proud Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service was a shadow of itself. The men who had trained for years before the war were gone, their replacements killed within weeks or even days of entering combat. The Zero, once the symbol of dominance, had become little more than a suicide craft. The only way left for Japan to strike at the American fleet was through kamikaze missions. Pilots deliberately turning themselves into human bombs. For the Hellcat, the role expanded. It was no longer only a fighter of duels in the open sky. It was now the shield against desperation itself. April to June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa was the apotheosis of this grim reality. Operation Iceberg saw nearly 1,900 kamikaze sorties launched against the U.S. fleet. Hellcats flew endlessly, intercepting waves of attackers before they could reach the invasion beaches. In more than 38,000 combat sorties, Hellcat squadrons claimed 2,351 victories at a cost of 249 losses. The ratio, nearly 10-1, revealed the scale of superiority. Yet behind the numbers was something starker. Without the Hellcat, the kamikazes might have sunk scores of American ships and changed the tempo of the war. Instead, roughly 80% of suicide planes were destroyed before impact. Pilots like Lieutenant Eugene Valencia refined defensive tactics that turned mass kamikaze attacks into one-sided massacres. His division, known as the Flying Circus, perfected the mowing machine formation, for Hellcats in line abreast, 100 yards apart, sweeping through incoming formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his sector, firing devastating 6-gun bursts. Survivors of the Japanese missions remembered the horror of watching entire groups cut to pieces in seconds. By then, the technological gulf was beyond bridging. The Hellcat had evolved even further. The F6F model introduced water injection, boosting the Pratt & Whitney R2A20 to 2,200 horsepower. It carried rockets, bombs, and even the revolutionary K-14 computing gun sight, which calculated deflection angles automatically. The Zero's incremental upgrades could not compete. Its airframe, designed for the light battles of 1940, had no room for armor or additional power. Against the K-1 for sight, even the most skilled evasive maneuvers failed. Pilots who had once looped and rolled to escape discovered the Hellcat S-guns following them with machine-like precision. Even Japan's greatest ace, Saburo Sakai, could not escape this truth. In June 1944, he encountered Hellcats for the first time. Despite 200 combat missions and nearly 30 confirmed victories, he was nearly shot down. In his autobiography, he recalled the terror. "I performed my best maneuver sloops, rolls, every trick I had learned. The Hellcat followed icily, almost casually. I survived only because the American pilot forgot to release his drop tank before combat. Without that mistake, I would have died. If the finest Japan produced could not survive an even fight, what chance did the rushed trainees of 1945 have?" The human cost was catastrophic. By war's end, the Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. Only 270 Hellcats were lost to enemy fighters. The kill ratio 19-1 was unmatched in modern history. 305 American pilots became aces flying the Hellcat. For Japan, the destruction was final. Of 18,000 naval aviators at the war's start, fewer than 100 remained combat-capable by August 1945. The kamikaze was itself an admission of defeat. Vice Admiral Tokejiro Onishi, father of the program, put it bluntly, if a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. The Zero becomes a bomb, the probability rises to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death has meaning. It was the mathematics of desperation, reducing human lives to percentages. The stories of Japan's last great pilots ended with bitter irony. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the empire's ace of aces with 87 claimed victories, escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Saiki on October 25. As 1945 dragged on, the pattern repeated. Young men with fewer than 50 hours of training launched and patched together Zeros and other obsolete types, only to be intercepted and killed within minutes. Survivors described the hopelessness of flying against an enemy who seemed to own the sky. Admiral Ozawa, who had commanded the fleet at the Philippine Sea, later called it Hellcat psychosis. His after-action report concluded, the enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat was not an individual fighter, but a component of a vast machine. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were engaging not men, but a system. We could not fight a system. When the war ended in August 1945, the Hellcat was still flying sorties. On August 15th, the day of Japan's surrender broadcast, Ensign Clarence Moore, a VF-31, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, the last aerial victory of the Pacific War. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the Emperor's words, had been approaching the fleet when Moore intercepted him. 2 bursts from 6 Brownings ended the Pacific Air War, as it had begun, in the Hellcat's favor. In September 1945, the first American aircraft to land at Atsugi Airfield after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crews gathered along the runway to see the machine that had destroyed their world. Lieutenant Robert Vauve, a Hellcat ace with 19 victories, demonstrated loops, rolls, and climbs, casual aerobatics that would have torn a Zero apart. Through an interpreter, he told the silent crowd, "This isn't even pushing it. In combat with water injection, it is 20% more powerful. The plane is stressed for 13 gigaseconds. I have never managed to break one." For the defeated Japanese aviators, it was not just a revelation. It was humiliation, the final proof of how far behind they had fallen. The engineers confirmed it. Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, studied captured Hellcats after the war. His conclusion was blunt. We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age. The Hellcat was not just a fighter, but the embodiment of America's industrial and tactical philosophy: mass production, standardization, survivability, and overwhelming firepower. At the Bethpage, New York factory, a new Hellcat rolled off the line every 60 minutes. In 30 months, 12,275 were produced. By comparison, Japan produced barely 6,000 Zeros between 1943 and 1945. The imbalance was not only in machines, but in the systems that created them. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. Kill ratio: 19-1 overall, 13-1 specifically against Zeros. Even Japanese veterans later admitted the truth. In 1962, at a U.S. Navy symposium on the Pacific Air War, Captain David McCampbell, America's ace of aces, declared, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War. Period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable." Sitting across from him, Saburo Sakai responded with honesty. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. For Sakai, who lived until 2000, the lesson endured. In his final interview, when asked about the Hellcat, he said, "The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future." Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion. The Hellcat's legacy was not only in victories, but in the philosophy it proved. The Japanese pilots had laughed at it when it appeared, mocked its weight, its armor, its bulk. They had not understood that every extra pound represented the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a system, a doctrine, and a symbol of a nation's ability to fight a modern war. By the end, the laughter of 1943 had been replaced by silence, by last letters home, by kamikaze attacks that were themselves acknowledgments of failure. The F6F Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero, it had destroyed an entire philosophy of combat, proving that, in the modern age, the nation that built the better system would always destroy the nation that built only better warriors.